Today, we are going to do a simple review of cholesterol lab results, including one you may not be familiar with, apolipoprotein B. If we were going to make a list of the different things we can do that may help us live longer, and this is by no means a complete list, we would very likely start with modifying our risk for cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease kills more people in the entire world each year than anything else, but it doesn't need to remain this way. Cardiovascular disease refers to problems with the heart and blood vessels. Cardio for heart and vascular for blood vessels. There are many different types of problems related to the heart and blood vessels. Here, we're going to focus on what's called atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, or ASCVD. ASCVD is just the medical term for when cholesterol and other things build up along the walls of our arteries and narrow them, resulting in decreased blood flow to parts of our bodies. This buildup of cholesterol and other stuff is called plaque. If plaque blocks blood flow and thus oxygen to the heart tissue, we call this a heart attack. If it blocks blood flow and thus oxygen to the brain tissue, we call it a stroke. There are a lot of different ways we may change our risk of heart disease. This is also not a complete list. This presentation will cover one way, what's essentially a cholesterol test called apolipoprotein B. Don't worry, if you stick with it, it's actually quite straightforward. You may associate cholesterol with foods like eggs. You may have lost a loved one and know it was related to their cholesterol in some way. You may have been told you have high cholesterol and might be on medication to lower it. But what exactly are you trying to lower, and how does this affect your risk of heart disease? When we are finished, we will understand what these test results are actually measuring, and what this ApoB test is measuring and why it helps us determine our risk of ASCVD. A typical cholesterol panel result looks something like this. It has all of these words and abbreviations on one side, and that gives us our results, and then the reference ranges for what are considered desirable results. These reference ranges make us feel very good or very bad about our results. If we review what these results are measuring, it will lead us to the very important ApoB lab result we also need. A lab result you don't see on the previous panel, and you likely have not had checked on yourself. First, I want to point out that this non-HDL lab result isn't actually measuring anything. It's just a calculation of how much of this total cholesterol, here 211, is not inside these HDL-sized particles. See how 211 minus 61 equals 150? I'll explain why the lab gives us this number near the end, but for now, we're going to remove it for simplicity. And for more simplicity, we're going to move this triglyceride result over here, and then indent these numbers, and then add these colors to make it all much easier to understand. Our total cholesterol is basically the amount of cholesterol inside each of these different particle types. Let's ignore this one for now and focus on these different particle types. These particles are all called lipoproteins, and they are different sizes and thus densities. They get their names from their different densities relative to water. High density heavier lipoproteins, HDL, lower density more buoyant lipoproteins, LDL, and very low density superbuoyant lipoproteins, VLDL. There's even one in the middle. These particles are different densities, basically because of the different amounts of cholesterol, shown here in yellow, and triglycerides, shown here in purple, inside of them. Let's add that triglyceride result back now. Just imagine these different particles are just different sized salt shakers containing cholesterol and triglycerides. And to measure their contents, you just shook them out and counted how much cholesterol and triglycerides were inside all of them. That's basically what these two numbers are telling you. The total amount of cholesterol and the total amount of triglycerides inside each of these different particle types. For the cholesterol result, the lab actually breaks the number down into how much cholesterol is in each different particle type, or salt shaker type in our analogy. For the triglycerides, it only gives the total. Notice how 61 plus 142 plus 14 is pretty darn close to a total cholesterol of 211. It's not exact for reasons that aren't helpful to review right now. So this is the total amount of cholesterol inside each of these particle types, and they break it out for us by particle type. And this is the total amount of triglycerides inside each of the same particle types, but they don't break it out for us. They only give us the total. Now on to the stars of today's show, these lower density particles I've made blue. But first, let's bring back that non-HDL result from earlier. As you can see, it's also blue. The non-HDL result is the cholesterol inside these particles, not inside the HDL. And the cholesterol inside these particles is what's most associated with the plaque buildup in our arteries we talked about before, ASCVD. Your provider knows this, and this is why they are likely to focus on these numbers first, and why they may refer to this cholesterol as quote-unquote bad. And this brings us, at last, to Apo B. These particles have other differences than just their densities. I made this one green, in part because it has a different surface protein than the blue ones. There is an apolipoprotein A on its surface. And there are apolipoprotein Bs on these. This one also has a B, as you would likely guess. As you know, this number tells you the total amount of cholesterol within our particles with that ApoB protein. But what it doesn't tell us is how many of these particles we have. And as it turns out, the number of particles is very important. Back to our salt shaker analogy. We could have a little bit of cholesterol and a whole bunch of these ApoB particles, or the exact same amount of cholesterol and a much smaller number of ApoB particles. It's the number of ApoB carrying particles that most strongly predicts our risk of ASCVD. The higher the number of ApoB particles, the higher our risk of ASCVD. Two people with the exact same amount of cholesterol inside of their ApoB containing particles, here that total is 150, do not necessarily have the same risk. we need to know the number of those particles to most accurately determine our risk. And notice how the number of our ApoB particles is nowhere to be found on the typical panel. If you read through some of the guidelines on how to manage cholesterol and do a search for the term apolipoprotein B, you can see that it clearly states that apolipoprotein B is a stronger indicator of atherogenicity, which means it predicts plaque buildup in the arteries, more than the LDL cholesterol value alone. The ApoB test is giving us the number of the most atherogenic or potentially plaque-forming particles in our blood. And it's helpful to understand that although ApoB is counting all B-containing particles, it is by far counting the number of LDL particles we have. And that's because although all of these particles have an ApoB protein, these are essentially active in our blood for such a short period of time that when we test for ApoB particles, it's almost completely counting our LDL particles. It's not telling us how much cholesterol is inside of our LDL particles. We now know, of course, that's what this number is telling us. It's also helpful to know that there is a test called an LDL particle count, and that it is basically giving you the same result as the ApoB test. So it's okay to use that if your provider prefers it, but ApoB is in the guidelines. We want to know both the number of ApoB particles and how much cholesterol they carry. For assessing risk of ASCVD, we've gotten more specific over time. First, it was noted that high total cholesterol was associated with ASCVD. Then, it was noted that high LDL cholesterol was even more associated with ASCVD. We now know it's the total amount of cholesterol inside the ApoB particles and how many of those particles we have carrying that cholesterol that is most associated with ASCVD. We want our plaque-associated ApoB lipoprotein number as low as we reasonably can achieve. And by default, this will lower the total amount of ApoB cholesterol. Although I'm not a doctor and can't give any medical advice, ideally my goal is to get my ApoB 100 down to between 30 and 40. Quickly, make sure you're getting the ApoB 100 that the liver makes, not the ApoB 48 that the intestines make. In the next video, we will review another heart disease test we need, what sounds like the hip-hop star of the cholesterol-associated molecules, Lp(a), and what tools like medicines we have to lower these lab values to help us and our loved ones achieve a long and healthy life.